This is The Other 51. I'm Bryant, and this week, my guest is Mike Sielski, a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and the author of The Rise, Kobe Bryant and the Pursuit of Immortality. My guest today is a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is the author of the new book, I'm going to get the title right, The Rise, Kobe Bryant and the Pursuit of Immortality, and more importantly, a fellow Godzilla aficionado. Mike Sielski, welcome back to The Other 51.
Brian, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It is always a pleasure to chat with you. And before we get to the book and Kobe and all of that, quick thoughts on Godzilla Kong from 2021.
So disappointed in it. Disappointed. So many. This is going to sound stupid because we're talking about a Godzilla movie, but they left so many plot points on the cutting room floor that it just made for a ridiculous movie. Like you don't have, it doesn't have to be The Godfather, but you got to pay at least a little respect to logic and like obvious things. Like one of the main characters, one of the main villains in this movie has a connection to one of the main characters in the previous two movies, and they never spell it out. They never say it. It's amazing. Like, I want to see, giant monsters crush cities and beat each other up as much as the next guy, but I need just a tiny bit more than that. And that was why I like the Gareth Edwards 2014 version so much. It was kind of like the highbrow version of this sort of genre. And I liked the next one a little bit less, and I liked this one even less than that.
Well, my problems with this one, like it was a fun movie, which is kind of what you're looking for, especially in 2020, 2021. Like those are the fun movies that we kind of need. But yeah, they really did steer into the forget plot. We're just going to have the monsters fight each other, which time and place for that. But yeah, a little plot, a little acknowledgement that this is a story that's being told. I also hated that for most of the movie, Godzilla was the bad guy and Kong was the sympathetic hero of it. And I'm just, I as a Godzilla guy, I had problems with that.
I did too. And I read interviews with the director who talked about he wanted to, it sounds so silly at some level that we're discussing this kind of film on this level, but that he wanted to restore the Kong character and all of that. But I felt the same way you did. Like the previous two movies, Godzilla's the hero, and all of a sudden he turns heel. And so, yeah. And I thought that it just felt rushed to me. It felt totally rushed. It felt like, they didn't really it was almost the antithesis of the previous movie. Like the previous movie was so geared toward hardcore fans that I thought it missed some opportunities to be more accessible and to tell a better story. This one went the other way. We're just going to show these two guys beating the crap out of each other, and we're not going to pay any mind to what came before. And it was disappointing.
Yeah. So this is, of course, the backdoor pilot to the Godzilla podcast that everyone absolutely needs. But we will return to that eventually. But I do want to talk about the book, which is out today as you're listening to us, in a few days as we're recording this. Your Kobe Bryant biography. Congratulations. It's so well done. I was able to get you helped me get an advanced copy of it. And it's so beautiful. I think the best thing I can say, and I hope this means a lot to you, is I think Bill Lyon would be very proud of this book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. For your listeners who don't know, Bill Lyon was the sports columnist at the Inquirer for years. Before I got the job, he was my mentor. And I appreciate you saying that, Brian. Thanks.
You're welcome. So you're probably doing a lot of interviews, so we'll try to steer clear of the base of the common questions. But I am curious, like where the idea of the book came from. Obviously, Kobe Bryant's death almost 2 years ago is the starting point for it in a lot of ways. But how did you decide that Kobe's time in Philadelphia was a subject for a book for you?
So the big hurdle mentally that I had to get over in that respect is that, and you know this from having covered Atlantic 10 basketball, Philadelphia is almost like an under the dome kind of city. It's its own self-contained entity in a lot of ways. So the story that I tell in the book is in a lot of ways fairly well known in that area. And the hurdle I had to get over was understanding that not everybody outside of that area knows this story particularly well. So once I got through that, I I shouldn't say, let me backtrack. So first, Kobe dies. I end up writing about him a fair amount for the Inquirer. I've known his coach at Lower Merion High School, Greg Downer, for a while. I've known this friend and confidant of his, Jeremy Treatman, for a long time, and known him better even than I knew Greg. So at one point, I approached Greg with the thought of writing a story about his relationship with Kobe. Let me tell Kobe's story through Greg's eyes. And this was a month or two after Kobe had passed. And Greg says, well, as it turned out, I just got back from his memorial service in LA. I was kind of writing thoughts of mine on a pad on the plane ride back. Let me type them up and let me get them to you. Maybe the Inquirer will run it as like an essay, as an as told to essay. And I said, that sounds great. And what Greg had written was so poignant and so moving that I thought, there's a bigger story here. There is a story about kind of Kobe's origin story. You know, Batman Begins for the Black Mamba. That was the elevator pitch I made for the book. And so once I had that idea, I went to Greg, I went to Jeremy, and I said, would you guys be willing to help me with this? They were. And because they still have so many connections to Lower Merion and to people who knew Kobe back then, I was kind of off and running. And, you know, to me, just a straight up biography of his entire life would have been less interesting than trying to take this portion of his life, the young half of his life, and explain to people how he became the man and the figure he became, in all of that, in his good and his bad and his, you know, stuff you like, stuff you don't like, and show how all of that was founded in who he was as a teenager.
And that's one of the brilliant things about this book. I was talking about this on the podcast last week, is that I love biographies that take a part of a well-known person's life and do a deep dive rather than the whole kind of the whole story of it. And it's interesting to read too. And I'm curious what it was like to report, you know, kind of like in hindsight, because we know the ending, we know who Kobe becomes, we know how great he becomes. And I found it very interesting as I was reading the book, and when you were talking to people and quoting like extemporaneous sources, that it was very much like, oh, he could be good, he could make the league someday. And you forget that that's the level, like nobody really thought he was going to be or could expect he'd be at this level.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And that was, I was cognizant of that in the way I structured the book. The first chapter is the immediate aftermath of his death through the prism of Lower Merion and the people who knew him there. And then we kind of flash back in a way to the beginning, to his life's beginning, how he gets his name, and then the story takes off. And I did want that feeling of like, you know, you don't know whether Lower Merion's going to win the state championship. Here's the tension that people were thinking and feeling at the time. And there was a fair bit of it because Kobe and his family were so secretive. Like he knew what he wanted to do, but he didn't tell very many people, if anybody. And so that was, I wanted it to be a story. To me, kind of the backbone of the narrative was, in one sense, the state championship run that Lower Merion goes on in 1996. That was kind of the driver of the narrative in a lot of ways. But the other aspect of it was just Kobe's development as a person and how he gets to the point where the book ends, where he's just finished his first season with the Lakers and is poised to become this basketball superstar. You
mentioned the Philly world and the Philliness of it. And it really does feel like Philadelphia and Lower Merion and the main line, they're all characters in this book, as much as Kobe, as much of his teammates and his coach. Can you talk about that decision, kind of how you treated Philadelphia as part of the story?
Sure. That was really important to me. I felt like in a lot of the writing that had been done about Kobe, the sense of place that came with Lower Merion was not addressed as deeply as I wanted to do it in the book. You know, it's easy to say, well, he grew up in this suburban Philadelphia community and went to this suburban Philadelphia high school. Great. What does that mean? What does it mean for Lower Merion in its history, in its demographics, in its sociology, in the culture of this kind of high school in the United States in the early and mid 1990s? What does it mean in juxtaposition to Philadelphia? Because, you know, anybody who knows anything about Kobe Bryant knows that he was, throughout his career in the NBA, he was not well liked in what was regarded as his hometown, Philadelphia. There's a reason for that. Why? What are the differences there? How much does it have to do with him being from Lower Merion, how much does it have to do with his personality? How much does it have to do with his father having played for the Sixers, and the Sixers having an opportunity to draft him in 1996 and not taking it, all that kind of thing, beating them in the finals in 2001. So, this is not a point of comparison in any way, but I've heard Robert Caro speak very deeply and eloquently about the sense of place in a book. And I wanted that to stand out when writing about Kobe, whether it was Italy, even though I couldn't get there because of the pandemic, particularly Lower Merion, and even to a large degree, Philadelphia.
So how, as a writer and as a reporter, do you take that idea and then research it, report it, and then translate it to the page?
You do the research. You go back and find books of Lower Merion history. I spent hours at the Lower Merion Historical Society, not just looking at what it was like in the what the area was like in the 19th century, but talking to people who had lived there for a long time and how the demographics had changed, and talking to people who don't often get heard from in stories like this, because Kobe was kind of a unique case, right? He fell out of the sky, so to speak, into Lower Merion in December of 1991. He's 13 years old. He hasn't lived, because his family had lived in Europe for so long, he hasn't had the upbringing that most of the Black kids who go to Lower Merion schools have had. He certainly hasn't had the upbringing that most of the Jewish or Protestant kids who go to Lower Merion have. So what is that like for him? And what is this environment that he's being dropped into? So, go find Black families and Black people who had grown up in Lower Merion. What was it like for them? What were the differences between how the Bryants lived and how other families in that community had lived? What was the stereotype of the community? What was the sports aspect of all of that like? What was the academic aspect of all of that like? So how do you do that? You go to you talk to people, as many people as you can in the time frame you have. I went to the Lower Merion Historical Society, and the gold mine that they had was they had back copies of the student newspaper from the early and mid 1990s, which allowed me to verify stories that people who told me. I could say, oh, that really happened. That's true. That jives with what was going on here at that time. It gave me a sense of what was going on in the community that mattered to students at the time, and all of that sort of stuff. It gets back to your question about place. So, this, you just do the legwork. You put Kobe Bryant in the center of a piece of paper, you write his name, and you draw concentric circles around it. And you work from the inside out. Okay, if I obviously can't speak to Kobe. I tried to speak to Joe and Pam. They never reached back out to me. Okay, go to the next circle. Greg Downer and Jeremy Treatment. Go to the next circle after that. More assistant coaches, more players. Go to the circle after that. Classmates, students, members of the community, et cetera, and you just kind of work outward.
So how do you describe to people the difference, the Lower Merion as a character and then Philly as a character? Because Philly, the Philly basketball culture, I've talked about this before. I mean, it's very distinct. It's very insular, in good and bad ways. I mean, it's just a very basketball city. And how did those play? How did you report that? How did those play into the story that you're telling here?
Well, they played heavily into Kobe's thinking, so that made it easier. Kobe was aware at all times, once his family came back and moved back to Lower Merion permanently, Kobe was aware at all times that if I'm going to become a great basketball player, I can't just exist in the Lower Merion community. I can't do that. I can't just play pickup games at the local playground or even in Ardmore. I've got to go where the great players are, and the great players are in the city. So that forces you as a writer and a researcher to make that distinction that you're talking about. So history of the Sunny Hill League, what it means to play in the Sunny Hill League, what the Sunny Hill League is, what it meant, and how Kobe fares there. How does that relevant? How does that matter? The AAU scene, the teams that Kobe played for in the AAU scene, the other high school teams in the area in the mid 1990s that were great. Why were they great? How were their communities different from Lower Merion's? The history of Lower Merion as a basketball community wasn't great until Kobe got there. So I've got to create that juxtaposition. The Lower Merion is the kind of school district, generally speaking, until Kobe came along, it was the kind of place where soccer and lacrosse were the big sports. if you know anything about the main line, the term old money comes up a lot. And that's not the entirety of the community, but that's a big part of it. So you've got to tell that story, and you've got to tell the other part, because that's relevant to Kobe's story too. And then you've got to get, as you said, into Philadelphia. What was Joe Bryant's place in the Philadelphia basketball scene? What did his presence, what doors did that open to Kobe? Such as allowing him to practice with the Sixers in the summer of 1995 and play pickup against those guys. He probably doesn't get that opportunity if not for Joe, and Joe being who he is. So there's all these little kind of stories within the story that you've got to account for and make distinctions among, so that people get the full sense of the full picture.
I as an A10 guy, I appreciated Donnie Carr love that he gets throughout the book, and telling too, because Donnie Carr, again, for those of you who are not A10 people, a very good player at LaSalle for 4 years, came out of Philly. Roman Catholic, was he?
Yep. Yeah.
And very, very good player. Had some, I didn't follow his pro career, but I know he had a professional career. Very good player, and kind of one of the foils to Kobe throughout that time. And it's just interesting to know Donnie Carr's career, and then to know Kobe's career on it. So kind of getting at all these little stories that you're telling in all the concentric circles, how do you honor and tell all of those stories while still keeping it focused on Kobe? And like, you got the history of the main line, history of the Sunny Hill League, all these different important contextual things. How do you balance those with keeping, this is the Kobe Bryant story?
You keep in mind at all times how they're connected to Kobe, right? That's the key. Is if I'm going to tell you the story of Donnie Carr, it's going to be because I'm holding him up, as you said, the foil, not as a bad guy, but as a contrast to Kobe, right? I did the same thing. I mean, I was a student at LaSalle in the mid 1990s, at the time when we, had this delusion that Kobe was going to decide to come play for LaSalle because his father was an assistant coach there. But beyond that, I wanted LaSalle to be a factor in the book because I wanted to demonstrate and illustrate how Kobe's decision affected other entities, right? Like, that's why I tracked LaSalle and Duke throughout the recruitment process, and his decision of whether he's going to play for the NBA, go to the NBA, or play for college, or things like that. Like, here's the ripple effect of what this kid is doing, right? It's easy to take a step back and say, okay, well, Kobe's just got to make a decision. Is he going to go to the NBA or not? Well, there are ramifications to that. Duke is coming out of a not so great time in its program and is looking for a player like Kobe. And LaSalle is starting to bottom out after having been a pretty good program for a long time. And it needs a player like Kobe. And its coach, Speedy Morris, needs to recruit a player like Kobe to solidify his future there. And so you tell those stories because they're relevant to Kobe. Who was the guy who was at Lower Merion, who was similar to Kobe, who came before him? That's Wendell Holland in the late 1960s. And what does he mean to Kobe, and what does Kobe mean to him? You got to keep, Kobe's the sun, and all these other storylines are the moons and the planets that are orbiting around him. And you've got to keep that in mind at all times, and not dwell too much on any one of them. Just tell that little anecdote, or that thread, give that thread enough length so that it lives and breathes in its own entity, but the reader never loses sight of the fact that it's connected to the main thrust of the book. Like, a quick example, I know I'm rambling. The first draft of the manuscript, I had a lot more story in there about the Bryant family and about Joe and Pam, particularly Joe. And my editor suggested I cut that because it was taking too long to get to Kobe in the book, in the narrative, and it didn't have as much to do with Kobe. And that was smart. Like, reading the second and third drafts, the book just moves much more fast, much more quickly, and it's much more relevant to the story. It's, how does Joe influence Kobe? Boom.
I was going to say that I hesitate to use the word easy, because writing a book like this is never easy, but that had to help the organization process and the story process, right? Because you have that clear sun right in the middle of it, that focal point. And everything is, whether something's useful or how to tell along, how it propels and ties back to Kobe, right?
Yeah, that's it, right? Sonny Vaccaro. I'm not interested
Mm-hmm.
in Sonny Vaccaro's whole history as a sneaker mogul and as, why he left Nike, which is still kind of murky and nobody really knows, and why he came to Adidas. All I need Sonny Vaccaro for is, all right, tell me about how you came to sign Kobe, and what was it about you, maybe, that allowed you to form this connection with him. Arn Tellem, Kobe's first agent. What are the similarities? What do you have in common with Kobe? Oh, you grew up in Lower Merion Township. You idolized Joe Bryant. Those are relevant details, in terms of the pure storytelling. You mentioned earlier in the discussion, and I feel like I'm name dropping here for the sake of comparison, and I don't mean to, but you mentioned earlier you love books where they're biographies that take a slice of a person's life and focus on that. And I do too. And not long before I started working on this book, I read The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson.
Yep.
Which is, for those of you who haven't read it and aren't familiar with it, it is the year of the Blitz in London. And it is basically Churchill during that year, okay? And how he responds and how he rallies London and England to enter World War II and put up its dukes and fight back against the Nazis. That, same kind of principle, right? Like, you're honing in on that year. Larson doesn't need to tell you everything about Churchill's involvement in the Boer War.
Right.
He doesn't need to do that because it's not relevant. Just give us enough so that we have a frame in our mind, a picture in our mind of Churchill. We're probably bringing something to the table. If you're interested in his book, you probably already are familiar with who Winston Churchill is and know a little bit about him, and then hone in on the story you're telling.
Mm-hmm. So, I know you're all the interviews that you did for the book. I know you did hundreds of them. And I'm curious, as you are doing this and you're doing a lot of the reporting, obviously after Kobe passes, how did you kind of guard in your reporting and your interviewing against either straight up like hagiography, like the Kobe as Black Mamba story, or just kind of like the general sense of, not speaking ill of him after he had died, or kind of getting at the truth of what he was like versus the story that's kind of been constructed around him from this time?
You have to ask honest but sensitive questions. That's what it comes down to, I think. I was fortunate in that even though there were a number of people who wouldn't talk to me because they were so close to Kobe and didn't feel like they could or didn't want to or whatever, mm-hmm. There were a number of people who had never spoken about Kobe who wanted to. Kobe was a member of the Student Voice at Lower Merion, the Black Student Union organization there. Nobody knew that. And nobody had ever talked to anybody about that aspect of Kobe's life. So the people I spoke to about that were really eager to talk to me about this side of him. And so what I found that was interesting was that people would volunteer information and anecdotes about him that rounded him out, that weren't just praise, that weren't just he was the greatest thing ever. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to mention it overtly because I want people to read the book, but there's an anecdote in there that his high school guidance counselor told me about. And I see you shaking your head and you know which one it is. I didn't ask him about that. He just offered it to me, and it blew me away that he would. And I found people were willing to do that time after time and I told everyone up front, look, I'm not just writing, this is not going to be a book that is Kobe Bryant is the greatest thing in the history of things. And so tell me every awesome thing about Kobe Bryant. It was, I'm telling this story. Please help me tell this story in all its honesty, in all its depth and breadth. And I was fortunate that people were willing to do that.
Do you find that people respond to that and respect that when you approach them like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The more honest and upfront you can be, I think the better you can, the better the outcome as a reporter and as a writer. Don't try to trick people. There are tricks we all use as journalists to, in interviews and things like that. You throw a couple softball questions to start, and then that warms the interviewee up, and then you can really dive in and ask the tougher questions, the more sensitive questions. But more than anything, be upfront about what you're trying to do, what the aim of your piece is, what you're trying to accomplish, and try to come at them in good faith and hope that and expect them to respond to you in good faith. And I think good things will happen in your writing and reporting.
So you wrote this while you were still a columnist for the Inquirer and have two young boys at home. What were writing days like for you? How did you kind of fit this? What did the actual process? How did you build it into your life and your job and all of that?
So this is going to sound terrible to say, but the pandemic really helped. Because all of a sudden I wasn't traveling anywhere. I wasn't driving down to Sixers games or Flyers games or Big Five games. I didn't have to go to Eagles press conferences anymore. I was here bunkered in my home office most of the time. And because sports had gone away, what were we writing about anyway? Like, you were just kind of coming up with stuff off the cuff. So I had more time, and I could make phone calls here. I could drive to Greg Downer's home. He lives 20 minutes from me, and we could sit on his back porch during the summertime and socially distance and talk for hours and hours. I could go to the Lower Merion Historical Society. It was a strange confluence of events. Now, there were things that I couldn't do that I wanted to do. I couldn't go to Italy. There's a big section of the book that has to do with Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I couldn't go to Myrtle Beach, but I was able to track down a number of people just here from my home office and then arrange in-person interviews where I could and balance the writing of the book, the reporting and writing of my column. I also got, at the beginning of the pandemic, I got moved into a different kind of writing position. At the Inquirer, they took my column away from me and moved me to this other more feature-y oriented section of the paper. So I literally was not writing as often.
Okay.
And so I'm grateful for that. Like, that let me write the book in a lot of ways because I just wasn't working as much. I don't know why that decision was made, but it was, and I'm grateful for it because it allowed me to take more time to work on the book.
So this is your third book. What was different, or what did you learn from the first two books that you put here, or what didn't you know from those first two books that affected your writing here?
Well, the first one is called How to Be Like Jackie Robinson, and that was a kind of a project into and unto itself. I co-authored that book with Pat Williams, used to be the general manager of the Sixers and the president of the Orlando Magic, and he writes a lot of books kind of inspirationally oriented. So Pat would do all the research and just send it to me, and I would sift through it and write it. The other book you're talking about is called Fading Echoes, and it came out in 2009. It's about two guys from a small town in Bucks County in suburban Philadelphia who were on opposite sides of a high school football rivalry as seniors, and then both went on and served in Iraq. One became a Marine, the other became an Army Ranger, and one was killed in action. And your question is a good one, because what I learned from that book and what I didn't want to apply to this one was I spent an awful lot of time in that book giving football play-by-play. And I did too much of it. I thought there was this inherent drama of the season, and I spent too much time on the football relative to the war and military aspects of their story. That book needed to be like 20,000 words shorter. And those 20,000 words needed to come out of the first 5 chapters. It's still, I'm still very proud of it.
Sure.
I still think it turned out fine and really well, but it could have been even stronger if I tightened it up a little bit. And so I was very cognizant of that in this one. I didn't want to go into too much detail into any one of Kobe's games. Like, it was a play here, play there, set the scene, that sort of thing. Maybe describe his actions on the court a little bit, but not go play by play of this game against this team or the state championship game or that sort of thing. And I felt like, as we talked about earlier, the book moved faster for that reason.
So I ask everybody I have on the podcast this. I will ask you, what's the best thing that you've read lately?
2 things. I read Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe, which is all about the Sackler family who started Purdue Pharmaceutical, which in turn created OxyContin, and is a big reason we're in the midst of a opioid crisis in this country. And if you know Patrick Radden Keefe's work, Say Nothing is an incredible book, and Empire of Pain isn't quite as good, but it's still tremendous. And then the other thing I reread just last week, just because I wanted to go through it again, was The White Darkness by David Grand, which is kind of it's a book version of a magazine story he did a couple of years ago about a British gentleman who tried to trek across the Antarctic. And, I'm a big fan of both Radden Keefe and Grand, and it was great to read Radden-Keefe's new work, and it was great to revisit, Grant's work.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention too, you've been doing a podcast kind of in conjunction with the book. So what's that? Tell us about the podcast and what's it like writing for a podcast as opposed to print or a book?
Well, the podcast is called I Am Kobe, and it's going to be 12 parts. The first 9 are out now. I've got 2 more episodes to record, 1 more to write. And it's got these tapes that I got of Kobe doing interviews when he was 17, 18, 19 years old, that his confidant Jeremy Treatman had recorded with him back in the mid-90s. So there's a lot of hearing Kobe in the moment back then. And in terms of writing it, it was challenging and interesting and a lot of fun, because in some ways it was a lot easier than writing the book. Like, text of things I'm going to, here's a paragraph I'm going to narrate, and then here's a clip. Mm-hmm. And then here's a sentence I'm going to narrate, and then here's a clip. In some ways it was really fast. And then in some ways it was challenging to write for the spoken word as opposed to write for the actual page.
Right. That I've ran into that in teaching. That you don't think of that as being different, but it is very, very different. Yes. So what did you learn about writing for the spoken word from this?
I need to simplify even more if I'm writing for the spoken word. I found that when I'm narrating the podcast, sometimes I end up shortening the sentences that I've written as I say them, because they're so long. And so, what works on the page doesn't necessarily work in spoken word.
Right. Awesome. Well, the book is out today. You can get it at an independent bookstore. There are links in the show notes. You can get it and wherever you buy books, get it, read it, enjoy it. It'll be the best sports book you read all year. It's January, but I'm pretty confident in saying that. Mike, this has been awesome. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.